John Howard's tenure as Prime Minister from 1996 to 2007 marked a turning point in Australian housing policy. His leadership era was characterised by significant economic reforms and a focus on creating a prosperous nation. However, some of these policies, particularly those related to housing, had far-reaching and unintended consequences that are still felt today. His government implemented a series of measures that, while seemingly innocuous at the time, laid the groundwork for the affordability crisis we face today. These policies were designed to stimulate economic growth and encourage investment, but they also had the side effect of making housing less accessible for the average Australian. One key policy was the capital gains tax discount. This policy was introduced as part of a broader tax reform package aimed at making the tax system more efficient and encouraging investment. Introduced in 1999, this allowed property investors to reduce their tax burden on capital gains by 50%. The intention was to stimulate investment in the property market, which it did, but it also had the unintended consequence of driving up property prices. This move, coupled with other generous tax breaks for landlords, fueled an unprecedented surge in property investment. Investors, seeing an opportunity to maximize their returns, flocked to the property market, driving up demand and consequently prices. Australians, enticed by the prospect of tax-advantaged wealth accumulation, poured their savings into real estate. This trend was further encouraged by a cultural emphasis on property ownership as a key component of financial security and success. The result was predictable housing prices began their relentless climb, outpacing wage growth and leaving aspiring homeowners struggling to keep up. The dream of owning a home became increasingly out of reach for many, particularly younger Australians and those on lower incomes. The Howard government's focus on homeownership as an aspirational goal, while understandable, had unintended consequences. By prioritizing policies that favored investors, they inadvertently made it more difficult for ordinary Australians to enter the housing market. By incentivizing investment over affordability, they set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately make housing unattainable for many Australians. The legacy of these policies is a housing market that is increasingly out of reach for the average person, contributing to a growing divide between those who own property and those who do not. This divide has significant social and economic implications, affecting everything from family stability to economic mobility and social cohesion. As we look to the future, it is clear that addressing the housing affordability crisis will require a rethinking of the policies that have shaped the market over the past few decades.
The Howard era marked a significant shift in how Australians viewed housing. During this time, the concept of homeownership underwent a transformation that would have lasting impacts on the nation's social and economic fabric. No longer was it simply a place to live, a roof over one's head. The traditional notion of a home as a sanctuary, a place of comfort and security, began to evolve. Instead, property became increasingly seen as a financial asset, a vehicle for wealth creation. The allure of real estate as a means to build personal wealth began to overshadow its primary function as a dwelling. This shift in perception, fueled by government policies and amplified by the media, had profound consequences. Policies that encouraged property investment, such as tax incentives and deregulation, played a crucial role in this transformation. As housing morphed into an investment class, the needs of owner-occupiers took a back seat to the demands of investors. The market dynamics began to favor those who viewed property as a means to generate income rather than a place to call home. The market became increasingly driven by speculation, with buyers betting on future price increases rather than focusing on the intrinsic value of a home. This speculative behavior led to a surge in property prices, making it more difficult for first-time buyers to enter the market. This commodification of housing had a dehumanizing effect, reducing homes to mere commodities to be bought, sold, and leveraged for profit. The emotional and social significance of owning a home was overshadowed by its monetary value. It also created a system where those with existing wealth, often through inherited property, had a distinct advantage in the market, further exacerbating inequality. The gap between those who could afford to invest in property and those who could not began to widen, leading to a more divided society. The commodification of housing also had social repercussions, contributing to a rise in homelessness and housing insecurity. As property prices soared, affordable housing options dwindled, leaving many vulnerable populations without a stable place to live. In response, communities and activists began to push back, advocating for policies that prioritize affordable housing and address the root causes of housing inequality. The debate over housing as a human right versus a commodity continues to shape the political landscape. Ultimately, the way we view housing reflects our values as a society. Whether we see it as a basic human need or a financial instrument will determine the kind of communities we build and the future we create for the next generation. One of the most persistent arguments against claims of a housing crisis is that it's simply a matter of supply and demand. Build more homes, the logic goes, and prices will naturally stabilize. While increasing housing supply is undoubtedly part of the solution, it's not a magic bullet. Australia has consistently failed to build enough homes to keep pace with its growing population, let alone address the existing shortfall. This chronic undersupply is driven by a complex web of factors, including restrictive zoning laws, lengthy planning approval processes, and a shortage of skilled construction workers.
Moreover, simply building more homes doesn't address the underlying issue of housing being treated as a commodity. As long as investors are incentivized to hoard property, driving up prices, increasing supply alone will not solve the affordability crisis.
Section 4 Open Doors, Closed Markets, Migration and Housing Demand. Australia has long prided itself on being a multicultural nation built on immigration.
While migration brings numerous economic and social benefits, it also places pressure on housing, particularly in major urban centers. High levels of immigration, coupled with insufficient housing construction, have contributed to the current affordability crisis.
The influx of new arrivals, while boosting demand for goods and services, also increases competition for a limited housing stock. This is particularly acute in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where population growth has consistently outstripped the construction of new dwellings.
It is important to note that blaming migrants for the housing crisis is not only inaccurate, but also dangerously divisive. The root of the problem lies in policy failures, not in the arrival of newcomers.
Section 5. Subsidising the problem, fueling the fire with government handouts. While successive Australian governments have acknowledged the housing affordability crisis, their policy responses have often exacerbated the problem. Despite numerous initiatives and promises, the gap between policy intentions and outcomes remains glaringly wide.
One glaring example is the reliance on demand-side subsidies, such as the First Homeowner Grant. These grants are designed to help first-time buyers enter the market by providing them with financial assistance. While well-intentioned, these schemes have primarily served to inflate house prices further. The additional funds provided to buyers often lead to increased competition for the same limited number of properties, driving prices up. By injecting more money into the hands of buyers, these subsidies artificially increase their purchasing power without addressing the underlying issue of limited supply. This creates a market where demand outstrips supply, leading to higher prices.
This creates a perverse incentive for sellers to raise prices, knowing that buyers have access to government assistance. Sellers are aware that buyers have more money to spend, and they adjust their prices accordingly. Instead of tackling the root causes of the crisis, such as restrictive planning regulations and tax breaks for investors, these demand-side measures merely treat the symptoms, ultimately benefiting sellers and existing homeowners at the expense of those struggling to enter the market. The focus on short-term solutions overlooks the need for long-term structural changes. Addressing the housing crisis requires a multifaceted approach. This includes increasing the supply of affordable housing, reforming planning regulations to make it easier to build new homes, and reconsidering tax policies that favor investors over first-time buyers. Governments need to invest in infrastructure and community development to support new housing projects. This means not just building homes, but also ensuring that there are schools, hospitals and public transport to support growing communities. Collaboration between federal, state and local governments is crucial. Policymakers must work together to create cohesive strategies that address both supply and demand issues in the housing market. Only through comprehensive and coordinated efforts can we hope to make housing more affordable and accessible for all Australians. The goal should be to create a housing market that works for everyone, not just those who are already well off. By shifting the focus from short-term fixes to long-term solutions, we can build a future where everyone has the opportunity to own a home and build a better life for themselves and their families.